and welcome to another video. And today we're doing something I've been talking about on social media for a while, and that is my top 10 definitive list of the Resident Evil games. These are my top 10 favorite games in the franchise. This is my 2019 version of the list, so I can include Resident Evil 2 Remake on the list. And anyways, here we go. Number 10 on my list is actually going to be a very controversial choice here, and that is going to be Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 6 is a game that a lot of people hate. A lot of people... here's my issue with the game. When it came out, I think the game was fine. I played through it entirely in its co-op, and I had a blast playing the game. I do think it's a little too long in the tooth. You know, we don't really, as gamers, complain too much when a game's too long, but in the case of Resident Evil 6, I feel like it's a game that is too long. But all the issues that the critics had when the game was reviewed, I feel like were issues that were persistent before the day one patch of the game that I just didn't have when I played through the game. Also, remember, I played through the game on the Xbox 360, and I'm sure there were all sorts of, no adaptive sync was on, so the game probably had a lot of screen tearing. I'm sure the frame rate was terrible. I just don't remember, because that was kind of before people cared about that stuff. Unless you were a hardcore PC gamer. And now, I've played through a good chunk of the game on the Xbox One. They put out an excellent port of that game over there. There's also a great PC port of this game as well. I liked the story of the game. I didn't think it got that ridiculous. I especially liked Leon's campaign, which was kind of a throwback to the horror elements. And I enjoyed Chris's campaign as well, which I always liked Chris Redfield. And I thought his campaign was actually pretty interesting. Especially the level where you're going through that kind of apartment complex and there's the invisible snake. I thought that was a really cool part of the game. Again, it's too long, and it's not my favorite Resident Evil game, but I think it deserves a spot on my top 10. We're going to go ahead and we're going to continue the controversy with number 9 here, and that is Resident Evil 7. I know a lot of people put this game higher on their list. I don't. Now, while I do think that it was nice that Resident Evil returned to its roots, so to speak, with Resident Evil 7 in terms of horror elements, if you take Resident Evil out of the name, this could have been any other horror game. And I think that's my biggest issue with it. Other than some of the Resident Evil aspects that they kind of shoehorn into this game at the end, and other than having, health herbs and that kind of stuff in the game, it doesn't feel like a Resident Evil game to me. It just feels like another horror game that I've played in first person. And I think that's the biggest downfall of the game. I don't necessarily think it's a bad game. I think it's one of the better Resident Evil games, but if you take that element out of it, you could have called this anything else. But it's still a good Resident Evil game. I still enjoy it. I like that it brought back all the elements that I missed over the last couple iterations in this long-running franchise, but overall it's lower on my list. That's number 9. Number 8 on my list is going to be a fan favorite, and that is Resident Evil Code Veronica. Code Veronica was a great game. It was one of the reasons I bought a Dreamcast. And then that Dreamcast, by the time I bought a Dreamcast to play this game, it was announced a couple months later, hey, it's dead. And that's unfortunate, but I loved the Dreamcast, and I especially love Resident Evil Code Veronica. It's great now for me to make this video and tell you guys that you can play Resident Evil Code Veronica either on the PlayStation through its PlayStation 2 re-releases on PS4, or through backwards compatibility, you can play the 360 HD version. That's a really good port of that game on the Xbox One, and they recently just did that. So those are really good ways to play those games as well, and I highly recommend Code Veronica. I think it's one of the best. I think it has some excellent puzzles. I think it's a game that if you do not pay attention to item management, you can really screw yourself over at the end. I think it has one of the better stories of the Resident Evil games, and I enjoyed that it was released as a stopgap game because, Nintendo and Capcom made their deal for Resident Evil 4, and this other, in-between generation was well, we need another Resident Evil game. Code Veronica was the game because they didn't want to number it. So that is going to be my number 8 pick on this list. Number 7 on my list, also going to turn some heads because of how low it is on the list, and that is Resident Evil 4. Now, Resident Evil 4 is known time and time again as one of the greatest games of all time. For me personally, I think there's a Resident Evil game in that trilogy of games that is much higher for me. Resident Evil 4, I think, is a really good game. I think it struck a good balance of being something new, changing how we play video games, changing how things worked in a Resident Evil game. But on the flip side of that, I think it also introduced some elements that people didn't like in Resident Evil. And I feel like it gets too much of a pass on Resident Evil 4, and those elements are in later iterations as well. I mean, again, Resident Evil 4, it did tremendous. It was a game changer. It did a lot of things for the industry, and the people that complain about the issues in Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 have to realize that the reason Capcom went that way is because you all bought like 1,800 copies of Resident Evil 4. I think Resident Evil 4 ties for Super Mario World as the game I've repurchased the most on various platforms since its release. So Resident Evil 4, I still think it's a great game. It is a game that I enjoy playing, I'd say every year, year and a half, but it's lower on my list, and that's at number 7. Number 6 and number 5 on my list are kind of tied here, and they're going to go in order respectively. Number 6 is Resident Evil Revelations 2. Number 5 is Resident Evil Revelations. I thought that this was a tremendous series. I would love to see them do a Resident Evil Revelations 3 at this point, especially if Resident Evil 8 will be a first-person game. However, we don't know at this time. I really like the Revelations series. I'm kind of combining them both together, but if I had to pick one over the other, I'd probably go with Revelations just a little bit over Revelations 2. I really enjoyed these games. My only complaint about the Revelations series is that on consoles, it should be a cooperative experience over Xbox Live, over, PlayStation Network. It's not a thing you can do, but you can do split-screen co-op, and it just doesn't make sense to me why that's not a thing. Which kind of brings the replayability of these games down a little bit. However, they're both really, really good games, especially if you're a fan of the earlier games before they switched over, and then also you're a fan of the horror elements of Resident Evil. This is a good blend of, hey, Resident Evil 4, but also some of the more action-oriented stuff. That's number 5 and number 6 on my list. Number 4 on my list is actually going to be Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is one of my favorites in the franchise. The reason I like Resident Evil Nemesis so much is it was a game that shouldn't have existed, right? So, we talk about Code Veronica as this stopgap game, but the actual reality is that Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was the stopgap game because Code Veronica was the true Resident Evil 3, but Sony kind of demanded another Resident Evil after how successful 2 was, and so they reused a lot of assets from Resident Evil 2, but I feel like they improved upon it as well by making it just a hair bit more action-oriented. They brought back Jill Valentine, and of course, who can forget the Nemesis himself chasing you around all the time. I love Resident Evil 3. I think it's a great game. I'm really crossing my fingers and hoping that, the next thing they do is remake Resident Evil 3, because it's the only one of this series that's not very playable on a modern console. I would love to see it. Who knows if it's going to happen? I think it will, simply because a lot of the assets they had to do for, the 2 remake are easily reusable for a Nemesis remake. So time will tell. That's number 4 on my list. Number 3 on my list was recently knocked down a peg thanks to something else, but sadly, it's probably going to be an even more controversial decision than what I've chose for some other stuff here. That specifically is Resident Evil 5. I adore Resident Evil 5. It is one of my favorite video games of all time. It's one of my favorite video games of the 360 generation. I had a blast playing this game. This is a game I still to this day come back to and play. I think between its excellent mercenary mode, which was the best in Resident Evil 5, I think between some of the other aspects of this game, this was my single favorite Resident Evil for a long time, besides number 2 and number 1, which we're going to get to. One of the biggest things for me is the co-op. I think the co-op was excellent and fantastic here, and it was a game that I played a shit ton, a metric shit ton of. Probably one of my most played games on the Xbox 360. There are great ports of this game on the Xbox One and the PS4. Also, there's a great PC version of this game as well. I love this game to death. I urge you to play it. Don't listen to the hate on it. It's an enjoyable, action-oriented experience. Number 2 on my list is actually going to be the recent release of Resident Evil 2 Remake. Now, I'm kind of tying this in with Resident Evil 2, but I'm leaning more towards talking about the remake because I think it's so excellent and it does everything that I wanted it to do. I loved and adored this game. It pretty much took up a good 2 to 3 weeks of my life playing. I've played through it about 8 times at this point. I love the game to death. I love everything that they did. They did a good job of remaking a game. This is now the true crown jewel of how to remake a game. Kind of like Resident Evil was for Resident Evil GameCube going from the PlayStation. They brought back Mr. X. He's awesome here. And I mean, obviously you can see how they could do Nemesis if they remake 3. The way he chases you around is just utterly terrifying. I love this game to death. I played so much of it. It is an excellent console release, it's an excellent PC release, and it is the shining example of how to remake a game. And yes, for the true retro gamer out there, you can also play Resident Evil 2. There's a multitude of ways to play that game. Also, one of the best of all time. And finally, number 1 on my list, it should come at no surprise if you guys have followed the channel at all. You guys know that my favorite video game of all time is the original Resident Evil, specifically the GameCube remake. I adore this game. It's a game that I play through a couple times a year. I love everything about it. It is probably single-handedly the game that got me into the horror genre as a kid when it came out on the original PlayStation, and then kind of reignited my love for the horror genre when the GameCube remake hit in 2002. There is an excellent new remastered version of that remake that came out in 2015 that's available on Xbox One, PS4. It's available on PC. I mean, what else can I say about this game or gush about it? I love everything about it, from its item management to its puzzles. I love speedrunning this game. I'll throw up the image here of my best time that I've ever had on the game. I cannot say enough good things about this. And if you're out there and you've never experienced any Resident Evil game whatsoever, please, I urge you to play Resident Evil, the original. And you know what? If you really want to bring yourself back 15, 20 years, don't look up a guide. Just play the game. All the answers to the game can be found in the different files and notes that you read in the game as well. This is an incredible game. I love it to death. Cannot say enough good things about it. So anyways, guys, that's my top 10 definitive list of my favorite Resident Evil games of all time. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember, as always, to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And until next time.